PR Connections Radio presents.
Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm host Ian Kelly, and on this edition, we are going to be doing a retrospective, and we're going to be looking back at a member of the Vegas Golden Knights who left this past offseason, and someone who, over the past couple of seasons, he did a decent amount of stuff with the Vegas Golden Knights, Henderson Silver Knights, AHL, NHL, and overall, when it comes to this player right here, I just want to kind of sit back and look at what Paul Cotter did with the Vegas Golden Knights organization. Now, for anybody who is unaware, Paul Cotter, he was traded during the NHL draft from your Vegas Golden Knights over to the New Jersey Devils. Vegas Golden Knights acquire Akira Schmid, goaltender in that situation. And then you also had, a pick, went to New Jersey, Alexander Holtz. He also came over to Vegas as well. But it's really interesting to see what that trade ends up looking like, who ends up winning it at the end of the year. Will it be Vegas when it comes to Schmid and Holtz? Will it be New Jersey with Cotter and eventually that draft pick when they do end up using that, end up eventually coming up into a system? But overall, when it comes to Paul Cotter, someone who was drafted back in 2018 with your Vegas Golden Knights organization, and something that a lot of people may have not noticed about Paul Cotter is that when you actually study the amount of seasons he spent with Vegas, it was a total of 5 years. He spent 3 years in the AHL and then just 2 seasons full-time in the NHL with your Vegas Golden Knights. And then he had a small cup of coffee at the end of his 3rd year with the Vegas Golden Knights. We're going to cover all of that, kind of looking back on it, like I said, here on this episode of Vegas Hockey Hub. Now, if you haven't yet, go to www.prconnectionsradio.com. Check out all the shows we have on the network. We have over a dozen shows on the platform, so I recommend checking those out. If you want to go to our social media pages, we are on all major platforms at Vegas Hockey Hub. And if you want to follow your host, I am down below at Ian J. Kelly. So to set this up and to really give you some background on Paul Cotter, this is someone that back in 2019, 2020, after being in the OHL, after being in college hockey for a while, being in the USHL, kind of cementing himself and really learning and progressing, Paul Cotter would start his first season playing with the Vegas Golden Knights organization, and that would be in that 2019-2020 season. And for a 20-year-old in Paul Cotter, this was a chance for him to really kind of set himself up with the Chicago Wolves organization. That's right, not the Henderson Silver Knights yet. That would be later on. But the Chicago Wolves in 2019-2020. And when you actually look at what Paul Cotter and the Chicago Wolves were doing at that time, in 2019-2020, this was a Chicago Wolves team that you do have some notable faces in that organization. Not only did you have players who are on the roster today, like Nicholas Waugh, not only did you have players like Keegan Kolazar, who was on that roster, but you had players like Nicholas Hague. He was there. You had Zach Whitecloud. He was with the organization. But more importantly, you ended up having some really solid NHLers who have been a good part of the Golden Knights organization. Guys like Brandon Perry, who spent a few seasons in Vegas. You had Gage Quinney, the first ever Vegas-born player to suit up in the NHL. Dylan Coughlin, he was a defenseman that played for a little bit with the Vegas Golden Knights before they sent him over to Carolina in the Max Pacioretty deal. And then let's also not forget that they did have some bottom 6 forwards at the time, people like Patrick Brown, players like Valentin Zykov. So overall, when Paul Cotter made his debut, and he was wearing the number 37, by the way, Paul Cotter in 56 games in his first season playing for the Chicago Wolves. This is coming from the AHL.com website. They have player profiles on all AHL players, past and present. And with Paul Cotter in his debut season, he would have 4 goals, 9 points, and would rack up 24 penalty minutes alongside a negative 13 while playing in Chicago. But you have to keep in mind, this is a Paul Cotter who's entering his first season playing professional hockey. Yes, there's going to be a transition coming from the OHL compared to the AHL. And with the Chicago Wolves of that 2019-2020 season, he would actually end up being on a team that, when you look at the standings for the Chicago Wolves, they finished with 62 points on the year, and that would have actually kind of put them near the playoff situation. But what ended up happening in 2020, you might ask? Well, COVID. COVID ended up happening, and because minor league hockey is not considered on the same level as professional hockey, despite the Chicago Wolves having 62 points on the year and the Chicago Wolves having a record of 27 wins, 26 losses, and 8 overtime losses, they did not have a chance to compete for the Calder Cup as it was canceled due to the pandemic. So after that first season with Paul Cotter, that first year kind of, earning his stripes out there in the AHL, the Chicago Wolves would not be his affiliate anymore, as the San Antonio Rampage would be bought by Bill Foley of the Vegas Golden Knights, and they would be relocated up to Henderson, and it would be the Henderson Silver Knights for the AHL. So, how did Paul Cotter perform in his debut season with the Henderson Silver Knights? How would he do in the inaugural season of the Henderson Silver Knights playing at the Orleans Arena out there in 2020, 2021? Well, he showed some form of progression, as in just 38 games in 2020, 2021, he would end up having 5 goals and 16 points with the Henderson Silver Knights. And I also want to mention this, that when it comes to that 2020-2021 season, the Henderson Silver Knights, they would be in the playoffs that year for what they called the Pacific Division playoff. And the Vegas Golden Knights, who had the number 1 seed in the playoff that year, they would lose in the finals to the Bakersfield Condors of the playoffs out there in the Pacific Division. And in just 4 playoff games, his first taste of playoff action in professional hockey, he would have 1 point and 4 penalty minutes during the playoffs there. So for the Henderson Silver Knights, who had a very successful 2020-2021 season, like I mentioned, they finished second in that Pacific Division playoff. They were the number 1 seed in that Pacific Division playoff. And when it came to the AHL season for the Vegas Golden Knights, they ended up having a record of 25 wins, 13 losses, and just 1 overtime loss. That is, by the way, a 65% winning percentage for your Henderson Silver Knights. And the fact that the Henderson Silver Knights had the best record in the Pacific, and they were the runner-up in that playoff that I did mention, it was just really interesting to see that Paul Cotter was on that situation there. That Paul Cotter was on that Silver Knights team in 2020, 2021. And with Paul Cotter, and once again, this is from Internet Database, which, by the way, HockeyDB, Hockey Database, so many great sites of information. I always have to plug where I get my sources from. That team was very good that year, because not only did Paul Cotter, who relocated from 37 to 43, but he also was joined by a young Pavel Dorofeyev, who was making his debut for the Golden Knights. You had Jonas Roundbeer, who has become a contributor to the Golden Knights still to this day. You have Cody Glass, who was a 2017 first-round pick, someone the Golden Knights were kind of hoping was going to develop out there in the AHL. And then you had your defensemen like Braden Bahal, You had, some defensemen like Jake Bischoff, who's been a captain for the Henderson Silver Knights, and Katie Korzak, who was a young teenager at the time. But in terms of goaltending, the Henderson Silver Knights were stacked in terms of goaltending. Because not only did you have Logan Thompson, who was named to the All-AHL team and was going to be an All-Star if they had an All-Star game. It was canceled, unfortunately, COVID, pandemic. But you had Oscar Dance, who had been with the NHL team and had played in the NHL. You had Yuri Patera, who was a mainstay for the Golden Knights for so many years. And you had Dylan Ferguson as well. So because the Henderson Silver Knights did what they did in 2020, 2021, and because Paul Cotter elevated himself during those 42 games that he played with the Henderson Silver Knights, it looked like Paul Cotter was going to keep getting better and better and better with the Golden Knights organization. And that belief in 2021, 2022 was so impactful because in his third and final season playing in the minors for the Vegas Golden Knights, Paul Cotter had 3 accomplishments for the Golden Knights organization. In the beginning of the 2021-2022 season, this is from NHL.com, Paul Cotter would be recognized as one of the top 10 prospects in the Vegas Golden Knights system. And that is always a good indicator when you are a ranked prospect for a team, when you are 21 years old and you're establishing yourself as a minor league player. So that was the first good step, that he was a ranked prospect in the Golden Knights system. Number 2, Paul Cotter had a breakout year for the Henderson Silver Knights in that 21-22 season. As, according to Hockey Reference, in just 61 games, he had 21 goals and 37 points. And since you want to think that he's a scrappy guy, he had over 60 penalty minutes for your Henderson Silver Knights in his final season in the AHL. And despite the Henderson Silver Knights getting bounced in the first round of the playoffs, they would lose to the Colorado Eagles of the Colorado Avalanche. But this was a Paul Cotter who in that season, he really showed up. He really performed at an excellent level for the Silver Knights in that final season, being in the AHL. And as a matter of fact, when it came to Paul Cotter, this is someone who only Pavel Dorofeyev had more goals than Paul Cotter did in that 21-22 season. And by the way, that should be no surprise if you've been watching Pavel Dorofeyev light up the lamp in the NHL. That should be no shock to you. Paul Cotter, in terms of points, was behind Dorofeyev and Daniil Myromanov. So yeah, Myromanov, that's a name that from the past that we wish was back. Yeah, he had more points than him that year. And then penalty minutes, outside of Braden Bahal, Paul Cotter was among the leaders on the Silver Knights when it came to penalty minutes. So overall, for a guy like Paul Cotter, he really exceeded expectations in the 21-22 season. And those expectations, he was rewarded with that. As in the 2021-2022 season, the Vegas Golden Knights would recall Paul Cotter on November 8th. And on the next day, November 9th, 2021, the Seattle Kraken and the Vegas Golden Knights would compete, and Paul Cotter would make his first ever start in the NHL. And as someone who has watched the NHL for a long time, I love seeing that rookie lap that they do in the NHL. When you have a young guy, this is going to be his first ever time stepping on the ice in the NHL, and they kind of allow him to have that moment that a rookie is never going to forget. And for a guy like Paul Cotter to make that debut against the Seattle Kraken, it was a memorable moment for Paul Cotter. That's something that you always want and you want to achieve for any hockey player, and he got to do that year. And then in 2021-2022, Paul Cotter would have 7 games that he would play. And it mostly happened in November. So due to injuries and due to certain situations, Paul Cotter would play for a decent amount of time in the month of November. He would score his first ever goal in his second career game as the Vegas Golden Knights took on the Minnesota Wild, and the goaltender that he beat was Cam Talbot. So for the Minnesota Wild and Vegas Golden Knights, he would score in his second ever game. Fast forward 2 games later, the Vegas Golden Knights would take on the Detroit Red Wings, and he would score his second and final goal of the season in the NHL, as he would shoot one past Thomas Greiss, and it would be a 2-goal season for Paul Cotter. And when it came to DJ Paulie C, as so many people in the Vegas Golden Knights like to call him, this was a 7-game stint for him that he would always remember. Now, later on in the season, after he got sent back to the AHL at the end of November, he would get called up once again, and that was in March. So in March of 2022, Paul Cotter would get called up again. He would only be on a 1-game stint this time. It would be against the Winnipeg Jets, but for a guy like Paul Cotter, this is someone who is being on the bottom 6 out there in Vegas in his debut season. So, after the 2021-2022 season, Paul Cotter, he would no longer put on that Silver Knights jersey. He would hang it up somewhere. He would put it in a photo frame and put it on a wall somewhere. He's not going to be wearing a Henderson Silver Knights jersey at that point. So, in 2022-2023, Paul Cotter's first full-time season playing in Vegas. Well, how did Paul Cotter perform in his debut season playing for the Golden Knights? Well, to say that he impressed a lot of people would be an understatement. In that first full-time season, being in the Golden Knights organization, there was a few games where Paul Cotter was on the first line with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, I know some people think, well, injuries, but hey, you have to take advantage of opportunities. Very similar to how Nicholas Waugh has been on the first line in the last 2 seasons when injuries have happened. When it's a moment, it's an opportunity, you got to take advantage of it. So, did Paul Cotter take advantage of that situation? Well, let me just tell you like this. Paul Cotter in 22-23, he had 13 goals in 55 games that year for the Vegas Golden Knights. Paul Cotter ended up having a really stellar year out there in Vegas. And I also want to point out that this was a guy who had a multi-goal game against the Washington Capitals. He also had a multi-goal game against the Boston Bruins during that season. And even though Paul Cotter, in terms of playoff, he did not suit up for the Golden Knights, even though he was on the roster, but he was a healthy scratch in 22-23. I don't think anyone can take away the middle 6 opportunities that Paul Cotter had. And at the end of that 22-23 season, he had 18 points, and like I mentioned, 13 of them being goals in 55 games. He also did not accumulate that many penalties. He had less than 20 penalty minutes in that first full-time season. And when the Vegas Golden Knights won their Stanley Cup championship in 2023, when they defeated Florida in the Stanley Cup finals and they hoisted the Stanley Cup at T-Mobile Arena, I was there, greatest moment of my life. But when it comes to Paul Cotter, he was in the locker room, he hoisted the Stanley Cup, and Paul Cotter, his name is forever going to be on the Stanley Cup trophy. And for a guy like Paul Cotter, who was only 23 years old at this time, it seemed like his career was going to go this and this and this from this moment forward. And as somebody who was watching him and seeing him progress as a unit, this was someone in Paul Cotter who I kind of sat back and watched and was like, you know what? Let's see how he does in his second full-time season playing for the Golden Knights. I just wanted to see how well would he progress off of that 13-goal season he had in his first full-time year. Well, unfortunately for Paul Cotter, he would unfortunately have not a great year. As Paul Cotter, who would start out on the middle six, he was someone who was kind of on that third line. He'd be called up to the second line at times. He'd be put down to the fourth line. He was a healthy scratch for a couple of games. People who watch Vegas Hockey Hub recap, I did the entire 23-24 season. Trust me, I got to see Paul Cotter during that entire time. And in 76 games this past season, Paul Cotter had 7 goals in 76 games. For comparison, he had 6 more goals in 21 less games. And that was considered a down for Paul Cotter. This was someone who showed so much progress in that season prior. So for him to only have 7 goals, and despite only playing in, almost all but 6 games that year, it was considered a step down. And the amount of penalty minutes that he accumulated went up from the year before. In fact, he almost tripled the amount of penalty minutes he had the year prior. In fact, it looked very similar to when he accumulated all those penalty minutes in his final year in Henderson. Let's remember, he had over 60 penalty minutes in his final year in the AHL. He had 41 penalty minutes in his final season here in Vegas. And the one critique that a lot of people had, and I was one of them, is that he would make unnecessary mistakes. He would cause penalties that negatively affected the Golden Knights more than it positively affected the Golden Knights. And when it came to Paul Cotter, he was not on the playoff roster for the Golden Knights. So for the second year in a row, despite playing 76 games in the regular season, Paul Cotter would be one of the 5 healthy scratches the Golden Knights had against Dallas. And some people would say that was the writing on the wall for Paul Cotter, that, when he was left off the playoff roster as a healthy scratch for the second year in a row, some people saw it as, the Golden Knights really trying to figure out what they were going to do long term. Where did he fit in that schedule? But when it came to Paul Cotter, I do have to give him one bit of credit in 23-24. Now, despite having the less amount of goals, he tripled the assists. He only had 5 assists in 22-23. He had 18 in 23-24. Shout out to Puckpedia, by the way, for giving me this information. And even though Paul Cotter had less goals from the year before, he had 7 more points than the year prior. However, you have to issue the caveat. He had 7 more points in 21 more games. So, if you were someone who really was analyzing that, is that great progress or not? To go up by 7 points with 21 more games played, is that considered an improvement? And when I went back and I saw my report card that I did with Paul Cotter, this was just a situation. He got a C. It just kind of looked like an average middle 6 forward. And unfortunately, that was the end result in 23-24. Now, Paul Cotter, at the end of the season, the Golden Knights were making roster moves. And we all know about the exodus of the off season. Trust me, here on Vegas Hockey Hub, we made a video the day of that July 1st. All right, it is one of the hardest videos we had to make on this channel, because the amount of players that left the organization was tough. And for someone like Paul Cotter to leave in that exodus, it was unfortunate. And part of me wishes that he was still on the middle 6 with the Golden Knights. But when you look at the current projected depth chart for your Golden Knights, all right, let's just examine it. All right, we're looking at it right here, right now, from this date in time. Would he still fit in the current day roster? I mean, looking at what we see right now, when it comes to the forwards, right, we're looking at the wings. All right, this is kind of a deviation, but I'm going to prove a point here. When you look at the wings, all right, on line one, you know, you have guys like Ivan Barbashev, you have Mark Stone, you have Victor Olofsson, you have players, for example, like a guy who with the Golden Knights organization, like a Brett Howden. There is so many players on the forwards, right? The wing depth, maybe you could make an argument that Paul Cotter would bring depth to the forwards, right? Because, yeah, we do know that when it comes to Victor Olofsson, he has been brought in as a free agent to help out with the wing depth. Mark Stone is your captain. He's going to be a vital piece of that. You have Ivan Barbashev, who they signed to a 5-year deal the offseason prior to this one. He is going to be there. Pavel Dorofeyev. They have so much potential with that. But let me pass this to you, and you can answer this in the comments if you want. Alexander Holtz is projected to be an everyday guy for the Golden Knights. They brought him in to be an everyday guy. But would Paul Cotter be in the starting lineup if they didn't trade him away? If you did not give him up, and with him in a draft pick essentially for Alexander Holtz and Akira Schmid, would Paul Cotter be in the exact same spot that Holtz would be? Because Alexander Holtz is supposed to be an everyday starter in the middle six. Paul Cotter was an everyday starter in the middle six for majority of the year last year. So if you're New Jersey, did you trade Alexander Holtz for Paul Cotter because you actually think there's more potential in Paul Cotter than there was Alexander Holtz? Or did you trade away Paul Cotter for Alexander Holtz because the New Jersey Devils see certain attributes and certain talents in his skill set that fit the roster more than Holtz did? So it really just depends on how you look at it. But at the end of the day, the depth chart, the projected lineup, Paul Cotter would still be on the NHL roster if he was here. But would he be a middle six forward? That is the question you need to ask yourself. Because that fourth line, let's just keep it real. On that fourth line, you have Keegan Kolazar, who is there. You have some minor league guys like Gregory Diansenko, Giannis Roundbeer. You know, you do have some young guys in the system that could be there. Brennan Bryson, for example, he'll be there. But when it comes to Paul Cotter, him being traded, there is a good way to look at it and a negative way to look at it. The good way to look at it is that the Vegas Golden Knights traded Paul Cotter away to bring in a backup goaltender of caliber guy like Akira Schmid, and to bring in someone who can replace him in the lineup like Alexander Holtz. The negative, if you want to look at it, is that the Vegas Golden Knights gave up on Paul Cotter after he had a letdown year in terms of goal production compared from year one to year two. And since we have about 45 seconds left, I want to say personally, as your host of Vegas Hockey Hub, Paul Cotter, I wish you the best of luck in New Jersey. I hope that you knock this out of the park. You have an excellent season in New Jersey. I wish you well. And in the 5 seasons you spent in Vegas with the organization, you were a really good asset to the team. You were someone that was kind and friendly to the fans. The fans, you know, they really responded to you. Trust me, DJ Pauly C is forever going to be liked here in Vegas. And when New Jersey comes back to T-Mobile Arena and they take on the Vegas Golden Knights, I have no doubt that he is going to be respected. And more importantly, he is going to be cheered when they do the video tribute for him. So, this is Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rakelli, and until next time, go Knights.
PR Connections Radio thanks you for watching this podcast. Check out more episodes of this show and our others at prconnectionsradio.com.